and the announcement yesterday?
Yeah, so we're very excited that we just heard last night that the Pfizer vaccine, which is one of our mRNA vaccines developed to prevent severe disease from COVID-19, received an emergency use authorization, or an EUA, from the FDA. So it's been a little over a week that we've been awaiting this decision, and that part of the process is complete. So the FDA has granted that authorization for the use of the vaccine, again, in children aged 12 to 15 years of age. So this is extending down from our previous emergency use authorization, which was from 16 years of age and older. So now the vaccine is authorized for emergency use down to age 12. So that is a very important initial step in the potential use of this vaccine. And so the next step that will need to happen is that the CDC will deliberate on this EUA, or the emergency use authorization. And then shortly after they deliberate and give some final words, then we'll be able to provide the vaccine to children in those age groups.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what that means to Spectrum Health, Rosie?
Sure. Yeah. So we've been anticipating this decision for quite some time. It was a couple months ago that we heard the data from Pfizer's study of the vaccine in this population, and really the findings from that study were astoundingly good, and so far that the vaccine, when given to those recipients in the 12 to 15 age group, was 100% effective in preventing SARS-CoV-2 infections, which causes COVID-19. So that was really exciting, a report that came from Pfizer in our medical literature. And so we've been anticipating that the FDA would be able to deliberate on the use of the vaccine and then authorize it for its use in the pandemic. And so here at Spectrum Health, we have been gearing up for this decision and preparing for what this will mean, because many adolescents and parents have been anxiously awaiting this authorization so that their children can finally get access to these extremely safe, effective vaccines to prevent COVID-19. So our earliest phase in offering the vaccine to adolescents 12 to 15 will be to use our clinic on 60th Street in Grand Rapids, where you can do a walk-in to get your COVID-19 vaccine. You can also call to schedule and use an electronic method of registering for the vaccine. Do keep in mind that these adolescents do need to be accompanied by an adult when they go to get the vaccine, but we're very excited that once the CDC gives their final nod, we will be able to provide access to the vaccine to our teenagers in Grand Rapids and the surrounding areas.
And Dr. Sullivan, can you speak to, or one of you, can you speak to how it's looking for kids even younger than 12? Like what are the vaccine manufacturers looking at, and what might we expect?
Yep, so the studies are ongoing for kids younger than 12. Both Moderna and Pfizer are doing ongoing clinical trials. I thought that I saw Pfizer's hoping to have data sometime later this summer or early fall for kids under the age of 12, and Moderna is the same thing. So I would anticipate over the next several months, we're going to be hearing a lot more about the clinical trials from both of those companies and data for kids younger than 12 years old. And Johnson & Johnson, I know, is also launching a clinical trial as well, if they haven't launched it already, for people under the age of 18 as well.
There's a question from Kelly Rainey. Kelly, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So, with this new development, will there be a point, or at what point should the state consider requiring COVID-19 vaccines for kids in schools? Similar requirements for measles and polio we're seeing.
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's been on a lot of our minds as we're trying to think about the next phases of moving through this pandemic. And of course, school safety has been a really hot topic as well through the course of the pandemic, but very recently too. So with the 12 and 15-year-olds, and also the 16 and 17-year-olds have already had access to the Pfizer vaccine through the EUA granted by the FDA. So really, we will have high school students covered very nicely. Probably only about a half of middle school students, depending on the age breakdowns of your middle school, but high school certainly. And as Dr. Sullivan mentioned, then we will be awaiting the data from the clinical trials of the use of several vaccines in earlier childhood years, even down to infancy.
Mhm.
So the question about the requirement of these vaccines for school or any other type of activity, whether it be your workplace or anything else, we really have to think about that very carefully, because at this point in time, these vaccines, specifically I'll talk about the Pfizer vaccine, has been granted the emergency use authorization. So they're authorized by the FDA for emergency use. However, these vaccines are not what we call approved by the FDA, which is a later step in the process. And when we're under an emergency use authorization, for regulatory reasons, we cannot mandate the use of the vaccine. So until the FDA goes through the process and approves the vaccine, there can be no discussions about making these vaccines mandatory for school entry. Once they are approved by the FDA, then that will be a very careful consideration. And I'm not sure if that will happen on a federal level or a state level, or even a more local level. I think really a lot has to be thought about before we can really make predictions about what that will look like. So I do think we are a ways away from the vaccine being mandatory for school or even workplace until we get that FDA approval. So whether or not it should be mandated, I think is a completely different question. And I am not going to give a value judgment on that right now, but I would say that the use of the COVID-19 vaccines on a more mandatory basis for children, I think has a lot of potential upsides. So I think one of the most important things that we've learned in the last 6 months or so through the course of the pandemic has been the emergence of novel variants. And this is not something that is surprising, actually. We know that viruses, bacteria, all microbes, all living organisms change. They change over time, they evolve. And SARS-CoV-2 is a living organism, and it too changes as it reproduces and makes copies of itself. And we have seen that several of these changes have caused dominant variants, which can allow the virus to survive better. And so when we think about the vaccine and its role in preventing the virus from changing in a way that could be more dangerous to human health, really we need to think about how we can slow the spread and the reproduction of that virus. So the more people who get infected with the virus, the more opportunities the virus has to change in a way that could increase the fitness of the virus. So we've made a huge step by vaccinating a high proportion of our vulnerable adults in the United States. Undoubtedly, that has been an absolute huge milestone we should feel very, very excited about. However, what happens if we don't vaccinate a large population of the pediatric world? So children less than 18 years of age and our very young children. We know that children communicate viruses to each other very easily at a high amount. And really the rule of thumb of having a young child is to plan for them to be sick all the time. And we know that COVID-19 is going to be part of our normal circulating respiratory viruses. So let's say we didn't vaccinate any pediatric patients. If COVID stayed the same, we would have a very low hospitalization rate in children. However, we will continue to be, we'll have to continue to confront the possibility that the viruses can change in a way that can cause more epidemics or pandemics with large impact on the adult population as well. And let's say that the virus mutated so much that the current vaccines were no longer as effective at preventing severe disease and hospitalization. Then we're thinking about taking several steps back in what we're trying to do with getting our society functioning more like normal. So it's not something that we love to think about because we all just want to be done with the pandemic. We want to move past it. I do think we need to grapple with the fact that we are going to have many iterations of this virus. We know it very predictably with seasonal influenza. We know that every year we can expect that the seasonal flu will look very different, or not very different, but can look very different from the years prior. And so the vaccine needs to be adjusted every year. The more we allow SARS-CoV-2 to go through populations of people and make copies of itself and mutate, the more likely that we're going to need more vaccines to combat the virus in the future. Now, I can't say 100% that's certain, but that is very likely given the nature of what viruses do as they evolve and they pass from human to human. So Liam, you may have some insight on that as well, but that is my personal take when I think about the short-term and the long-term consequences of vaccinating children.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think it's definitely very important to get children vaccinated for the reasons you just stated, because if we allow the virus to continue to replicate uncontrollably in certain populations of people, more variants are going to be spilled out. And at some point in time, the concern is a variant going to be completely have the ability to escape vaccine-induced immunity? And that's the last thing we want. I mean, certainly no matter what, the virus is going to continue to evolve and mutate over time as it's replicating through the human population. But the less replication you allow it to do, the less spreading you allow to go through from human to human to human, the slower the rate of mutation is. Right now in the United States, I mean, it's getting better, but it's still replicating at a very high rate, even in the United States. That's not saying what it's doing in the rest of the world, where it's absolutely uncontrolled in some parts of the world, unfortunately. So we have to slow this thing down if we want to reduce these mutations and reduce the potential risk for vaccine-induced vaccine escape from mutants. I will add one thing about the FDA approval process. Pfizer, if I'm not mistaken, I read, so it's up to the company itself to actually submit full documentation to the FDA to get full approval. And Pfizer apparently is going to go through the process for full FDA approval for their vaccine very soon. So they have to submit a whole bunch of paperwork. That's a much longer and more laborious process, and it's going to take several months, but it's up to the company ultimately to request that full approval. And Pfizer is going to request full approval from the FDA for their vaccine. So that might happen at some point later this year. More information to come on that.
Looks like Val Lego, you have your hand up.
I do. So I was wondering whether, I know we talked last time about possibly making these vaccines available at pediatricians' offices. Is Spectrum still working that out? And I know that there's been some reports that there might be a third dose required, especially for the younger kiddos. I know those vaccine trials are not complete yet. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that, and whether or not DeVos Place will stay open and be a place for them to get vaccinated, or will it just be the Grand Rapids 60th Street location?
Yeah, there is a lot of planning going into making the vaccine available in a widespread fashion throughout the community at Spectrum Health, and then also at retail pharmacies. So a lot of infrastructure is being worked on for that, because we know that having the vaccine be available in one place may be completely unrealistic for people who cannot get around the city very well with impaired mobility, et cetera. And plus, a lot of people want to get their medical care at what we call their medical home, or the office that they usually go to seek medical care. So there is lots of work being done on that. I do not yet have a timeline on when that will be available at our pediatricians' offices. It may be that our retail pharmacies are able to get it into the community for our teenagers before our pediatric offices. I just can't say for sure what the timing of that will be, but that is the intent, is to be able to provide the vaccine in as many of those offices as possible. One of the biggest challenges with that, it's not just getting the vaccine there, it's the storage of the vaccine and how the vaccine is drawn out of the vials that they come in. So there are a lot of logistics around that, but the intent is to make it as widely accessible as possible to our pediatric and adult populations. For your second question, Val, I think you had mentioned or asked if there was going to be a third dose required for our younger children. I think it's just too early to say that at this point. I think it's a good idea to plan for two, and everybody should indeed plan for two. I do not know yet whether or not that third dose will be needed and required for the younger children to be vaccinated. Liam, I don't know if you have any additional insight on that.
No, I haven't heard either, but I mean, I know some doses, vaccines in younger kids, they do have to give additional doses because their immune systems are different than that of adults. And sometimes it takes a little more stimulation to get the appropriate immune response. So it wouldn't at all be surprising if that does happen, but I think that remains to be seen right now.
Yep, you're absolutely right. So for the parents out there listening, you think about your tetanus shot. And in the first year of life, your child actually gets 4 tetanus shots to get the appropriate immunity to protect them from that extremely serious infection. So it could be the case for the COVID-19 vaccines, but these vaccines also have a very different mechanism for how they stimulate the immune system. So in my mind, it's too early to predict that.
And it's also still too early to say if adults are going to need a third shot. Despite all the chatter you hear out there about booster shots for the COVID-19 vaccines, it's too early to say that. We got lots of research to do on that yet. So, that's a little premature to expect that we're going to need a third booster shot immediately 1 year after your first 2 shots. So that remains to be seen as well.
And Val, I feel like you asked a third question and I cannot remember what it was.
That's okay. I know, I was trying to get them all in. I just wondered whether or not DeVos Place would also be a location for teens, or are we strictly going to be going with the 60th Street location?
At this point, I actually believe that DeVos Place, and Liam, correct me if I am wrong, I believe that DeVos Place is actually winding down as a site. So I actually don't anticipate that will be the preferred place for 12 to 15-year-olds to get their vaccine either.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the issues with getting the vaccine into pediatric offices too, or any doctor's office for that matter, with the mRNA vaccines, one is storage because of the cold storage requirements. Number two, once you put a needle in the vial, you got to use the whole vial, because these vaccines don't have preservatives in them, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at that. So, because some people don't want preservatives in the vaccine. So none of them have any preservatives in them. So once you puncture the vial, you really have to use the whole thing up. Otherwise, you have to dispose of it. So that's another thing that makes it a little challenging to getting into physicians' offices in general.
Thank you. Another question from Brian McVicker. Go ahead, Brian.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Just curious if you folks have any sense for what demand for the vaccine will look like from people in this age group. Has Spectrum, for instance, heard from parents in the community saying, hey, boy, when is this going to be available to us?
Yes.
Thing, and then one other question after that is just, this kind of dovetails off what Val asked, but I was just curious, has Spectrum had conversations with any school districts in the community about having clinics at schools where the vaccine could be easily available to students in the area? So those questions, thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of what we've heard from parents, so the majority of what we have heard are actually from the patients that we serve at Helen DeVos Children's Hospital, which are children who, for the most part, have chronic medical conditions where they need to see a medical specialist here at the hospital. And that patient population, the perceived risk of COVID-19 to their own health is very high. And so many of these people have completely changed their lifestyles to avoid getting sick with COVID-19. And this could be from something as simple as asthma to something like diabetes, having a grown-up premature infant, to different neuromuscular diseases and whatnot, where COVID could be much more serious. And so those individuals have literally been waiting for over a year for a vaccine so that they can resume some semblance of a normal life. And so for those patient populations, this is literally the moment that they have been waiting for. And so they're extremely excited to have this opportunity to get vaccinated. So I think within those populations, the answer for many is yes, absolutely. We have been waiting and we would love to have the vaccine. I think we are lacking more data about the general pediatric population that is healthier. And so the decision-making about whether or not to receive the vaccine is a little bit less about their own personal health. So I would say for those with medical conditions that predispose them to severe COVID-19, tons of interest. For the general population, I think we still have a lot of education to do about the benefits of the vaccination for individuals and for communities. And now I forgot the second part of your question.
Second question is just, has Spectrum thought about it? Have you been approached by school districts in the county or anywhere about, hey, can we have a clinic at our school? This might be something where we could easily vaccinate people in this age group. Just curious whether that's come up in conversation.
Yeah, that's great. So Spectrum does work with the health department as well as different specific school districts, which are really wonderful partnerships. However, I would actually give a lot of the credit to our local health departments and their work with the school districts and retail pharmacies and whatnot. So we're here in Kent County. The Kent County Health Department has been working on this for literally months, and those partnerships are already in place. And so that I can't give you specifics on because it's a little outside of my purview. But really, I would have to credit the health department for working with all of the school districts across the board.
I saw a previous question on side effects and parental consent for the vaccine, and maybe we can wrap up after that.
Yep. So as I mentioned earlier, a parent will need to attend the vaccine appointment for any minor, anyone less than 18 who is going to get their vaccine. So there does need to be parental consent for the use of the vaccine. In terms of side effects, really the side effects that were observed in the study of 12 to 15-year-olds were pretty much identical to what was observed in the very large adult study of the Pfizer vaccine in 16 years of age and up. So the local mild side effects, around the vaccine injection site, very common, not serious. And then with the second dose, there's a possibility for more of a systemic reaction. Again, they're not serious events, but expected effects of your immune system being activated to be able to combat COVID-19. So I counsel my families that, I would anticipate that our teenagers would have very similar rates of those types of non-severe reactions to the mRNA vaccines.
Looks like Val, do you have another question? If so, go ahead.
I do, and this one doesn't have necessarily to do with Pfizer and kids, but while I had Liam here, I wanted to ask him his concern. I just saw reports out today that the Indian variant, the WHO is considering that a worldwide health risk. There's great concern over it. And I just wondered if you could just give me your thoughts on that and how concerned we.
Yeah, I know that there has been some talk about the variant, that one of the variants circulating over in India may have one of the mutations that potentially could reduce the efficacy of vaccination. So they're really looking at that very closely and doing a lot more investigation of it. So certainly any variant that gets spun off that has mutations potentially linked to reduced efficacy of vaccines are concerning. And that's, to me, that speaks to why we need to vaccinate more people. Because, unfortunately, India is an example of they have a very large population and there's completely uncontrolled replication of the virus going on over there right now. And that leads to more and more mutations in the virus, more and more potential for the virus to develop variants that could potentially completely escape vaccine-induced immunity. So those are definitely a concern, and we have to keep a close eye on that. And that's all the more reason that people should get vaccinated, because we have to reduce the circulation of this virus as much as possible. And vaccine is the best way to do that right now. We've never reached natural or herd immunity with other viral infections such as smallpox, measles, and polio through natural infection. That's not going to happen with this one either. Vaccination is the only way we're going to reach herd immunity for COVID-19. And I think people need to realize that letting this virus replicate and spread uncontrollably through the population is only going to lead to more and more of these variants. And at some point in time, one of them is going to completely escape vaccine-induced immunity and potentially set us right back to the beginning where we were. And the current vaccines work very well against the variants, and that's why we need to get as many people vaccinated as fast as we can to reduce this risk of more of these variants coming out.
One more question, I think, from Callie. Go ahead, Callie.
I'm sorry, there's a barking dog, so apologies in advance. Just wondering, are you all going to do any campaigns to kind of educate parents and stuff as to why this is a good option for them? Sorry, I'm mute.
Oh, that's okay. So yes, we are very, very passionate about educating families and getting the word out. I think what we're doing right now is one of those ways, trying to get the word out to as many people as possible. As a pediatric provider and working with a very large health system in West Michigan, it's actually the largest system in the state of Michigan. Really, we're taking this opportunity for all providers that care for pediatrics as well as adults to have the appropriate information to help messaging with every interaction that they have with families to talk about the COVID-19. And that can be face-to-face interactions, that can be, documents that we provide. So that is there as well. I mentioned the health department is doing an absolutely wonderful job, thinking a little bit even more grassroots. And then there's a separate collaboration through the state of Michigan called Protect Michigan that has a youth work group that is actually going as far as going door to door to getting information to families about the COVID-19 vaccine for children and adolescents and teens and all the way through adulthood, and actually getting people registered and getting them access to the vaccines as soon as possible. So it can't just be at a healthcare system, to be fully honest with you. Mm-hmm. That's not necessarily where people always go for their information. We know that the younger demographic prefers to use social media and their own personal networks to get information. And Spectrum Health is doing a lot of social media campaigning for that, as well as many of the individuals who work at Spectrum Health. But we have to think outside of the healthcare system as well. Think about the health department, schools, faith-based organizations. Those are all the different areas that all of these different parts of the healthcare system are thinking about engaging with families to provide that education. So the answer is yes. It's a little bit more complicated, but appropriately so. People are thinking very creatively about how to reach everybody to get the appropriate information.
And if you can indulge one more question, if you have a couple of minutes still, Justin Hicks has the last question.
Yeah, thanks for taking my question. For parents who are maybe hesitant and bring up kind of the idea of we don't know what long-term effects are of this vaccine, seeing as it's still pretty new, can you provide like an idea on the timeline to which any side effects from this type of vaccine could occur, and maybe how long this vaccine's ingredients or the mRNA actually last in the body?
You can see Liam and I smiling because we love this question.
Yeah.
So I'll take the first stab, and Liam will certainly have some to add to this as well. So the actual mRNA that your body gets injected with when you get the vaccine is a very unstable compound. When I say unstable, I don't mean radioactive. I don't mean anything that's going to make your body unstable. What I mean is that the body very quickly degrades that mRNA. And another really important thing to note about the mRNA, because if we go back to high school biology, mRNA is made by your cell's nucleus, but actually this happens outside of the nucleus of the cell where the actual DNA of the cell is. So the mRNA is actually only present in the cell outside of the nucleus. And what that mRNA does is that it's a messenger that encodes the production of a protein. So the mRNA tells the cell's machinery to make the spike protein, which is foreign to the human body, and then the immune system reacts to it and makes antibodies so that when it encounters the actual spike protein of COVID-19, that it can make an appropriate immune response and it prevents us from getting sick from the virus. So that whole process actually happens pretty quickly, but the mRNA that actually gets injected into the body gets degraded very, very quickly. And the other important point is that the mRNA cannot go backwards into the nucleus of the cell and cannot become part of your body's DNA. And I think that's a very important point to make because it is not possible for the mRNA to change our genetic code in any way, shape, or form. And the mRNA disappears very quickly. However, the immune system is incredibly smart and it remembers all of these different things that it has encountered, including the spike protein that the mRNA encoded. And so the immune system will continue to make antibodies against the spike protein to give us hopefully very long-standing immunity against COVID-19. So it actually cannot affect your body's genetic material long-term. In terms of expected side effects, the side effects from the vaccine are quite immediate. In terms of long-term side effects, really for vaccines, it has not been reported that an adverse vaccine outcome has happened outside of 2 months of when a vaccine is given. So when we're thinking about long-term side effects, like, 6 or 12 months or many years down the road, that simply is not plausible that would happen. So I think all the concerns about long-term side effects are actually quite unfounded and has not been a part of what we have observed for vaccines since vaccines were developed.
Exactly. Past vaccines that have gotten derailed because of side effects, it's always been within the first 60 days that something has happened that has derailed the vaccine. That's been true since the advent of vaccination. And it's, if we don't see anything in those first couple of months, you're not going to see anything with vaccines after that. And any vaccines that have what are called longer term effects, they always have short term effects too. And so, we're not seeing that with the messenger RNA vaccines. They've been incredibly safe so far, and they've been administered to, hundreds of millions of people worldwide, and the safety record of them is just beyond our wildest expectations and dreams. And we're very happy with it. And they've been in use now for, about 6 months, and there's been no major problems with any of them. So I think we're well past the time period now where we need to worry about long-term health effects from these vaccines. I think they've proven their safety, they've proven their effectiveness. They were very efficacious in clinical trials, and in the real world, they're proving to be every bit as effective in the real world. And so I think people can be confident that these vaccines are very safe. There are not going to be long-term effects from these vaccines. And I think they're going to be, incredible tools for us going forward.
I agree. And the last point that we'll just make, because this is the most common hesitancy for our adolescent population, is the concerns about fertility. So COVID-19 itself, the viral infection, has not impacted fertility worldwide, and nor have the mRNA vaccines. And really, that was a myth that is completely unfounded and has not borne out to be true. So just want to reassure our teenagers, our young adults of childbearing age, this really is not a concern. And I would certainly have my daughter vaccinated as soon as her age group gets approved.
Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate your time. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you, you too.